Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar hosted by the Policy Research Institute for South Asia. My name is Dr. Mary Hunter, and I'm a Director of Research at PRISA. I'm pleased to be joined by Michael Kugelman to discuss the impact of the Iran-Israel conflict on South Asia, especially with regards to relations between South Asian states and Iran and Israel, the gas and oil supply vulnerabilities exposed by the conflict, and wider implications. Michael is currently a senior fellow non-resident at the Asia Pacific Foundation, as well as a senior advisor for India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh at Horizon Engage, a geopolitical risk consultancy. He is perhaps best known for his work at the Wilson Center, where he managed the South Asia portfolio for nearly 20 years and was the founding director of its South Asia Institute in 2022. Michael is also a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine, for which he writes the South Asia Brief. I'll begin by asking Michael a few questions relating to today's topic, and then we'll end by opening the floor up to the audience should you have any questions for him. And please keep these until the end. So firstly, thank you so much for joining us today, Michael. And I wanted to begin by asking you if you could please summarize what led to the recent conflict between Iran and Israel and how it unfolded.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for including me in this discussion, and thanks to PRISA for the invitation. So, we all know, for the most part, what happened in this 12-day conflict. Israel launched strikes on nuclear facilities in Iran, and the scope of the targeting would expand in the days that followed to include individuals, including nuclear scientists and those that were a part of the Iranian regime. You also had a case of the state broadcaster being targeted in Iran, and this prompted a number of observers to think that Israel's goals with this operation extended beyond preventing Iran from gaining nuclear weapons into a goal of wider regime change. Of course, things did not come to that, but as we know, Iran responded to the initial Israeli strikes with its own strikes on Israel, missiles, drones. This continued for several days until the U.S. launched strikes in Israel on nuclear facilities. That then prompted Iran to retaliate by carrying out strikes in Qatar toward a U.S. military base. And it was at that point that, as I understand it, the diplomacy really picked up, including efforts on the part of the United States to negotiate an end to the conflict. And indeed, there was a ceasefire, certainly a fragile ceasefire, but that has held. And so at this point, the situation has de-escalated. But it was the first time that Iran and Israel engaged in direct conflict. Of course, as we all know, proxy conflict, particularly Iran's proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, facing off against Israel. But this is the first time that you had direct combat between the two, which is one of many reasons why this conflict, brief though it was, fortunately, was pretty significant, and I think something that scholars are going to be reviewing for quite some time.
Thank you. And kind of moving more towards the impact on South Asia, at the UN, we saw Pakistan strongly condemning what it terms, and I quote, unjustified and illegitimate aggression by Israel, end quote, against Iran. And conversely, India has stopped short of overtly condemning Israel's strikes on Iran, while calling on Iranian officials to avoid further escalation and to return to diplomacy. You described in a piece for Foreign Policy how India is accustomed to balancing ties between rival states, but that this was a particularly tough test for the country. I wondered if you might explain this statement and talk a little about the wider implications for relations between such South Asian countries and Iran and Israel.
Yeah, sure. So, as you know, India has long had a policy of strategic autonomy. It had previously been described as non-alignment. Now it's described as strategic autonomy. And the idea is for India to maintain flexibility in its foreign policy by not allying with or against any one country. And that has entailed, among other things, pursuing relations with rival pairs. And so, we've seen this over many cases, whether it entails pursuing close relations with Russia and the United States, which continued even after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Or we could also talk about how India has balanced its relations with both Saudi Arabia and Iran, as well as the Israelis and the Palestinians. But that gets me to the case for India of balancing ties between rival states was especially tough. That is because Israel, I would argue, has really been the India-Israel relationship has been one of the fastest growing partnerships that India has pursued in recent years. I mean, if you look at how this relationship has strengthened so much in relatively little time, it really is remarkable. And that ranges from the arms trade. Israel has become a critical source of arms for India. It's a top acquirer of arms from Israel. If you look at trade, the commercial relationship has really picked up, and India is increasingly looking to Israel to supply some of its biggest and most pressing needs, whether you're talking about technologies to make agriculture more agricultural policies more water saving, or whether you're talking about semiconductors. There's a lot going on there. And also, if you look at the two leaders, and this is one reason why this relationship has grown so much in so little time, Prime Ministers Modi and Netanyahu share a lot in common in terms of their outlooks on various things, from Islamist terrorism to many other things. And one could argue that their governance styles are quite similar as well. But what really was important for India most recently is how Israel was one of a very small number of states that fully backed India in its recent conflict with Pakistan. It was a very odd trio of states that supported India. One was Israel, there was also Taiwan, and of all places, Afghanistan. Taliban led Afghanistan. So that's important for India. But despite that, Iran is an important partner for India. The relationship is not tremendously strong, particularly ever since the energy relationship between the two has declined, in that India has drastically reduced its energy imports from Iran to reduce the sanctions exposure or exposure for India in Iran. It's trying to develop a port in the city of Chabahar, which India views as a very strategically significant entity that could facilitate its access to markets in Central Asia via transit routes in Iran upward through Afghanistan. So there's that. You also have almost 11,000 Indian nationals in Iran. But more broadly in the Middle East, there's a lot of strategic stakes for India. And of course, as we know, Israel's neighbors, with some exceptions, do not have formal relations with Israel, and pretty much every country in the Middle East rejected Israel's military strikes, including those countries that have formal relations with Israel. These are important partners for India, whether you're talking about Egypt or whether you're talking about Saudi Arabia, the UAE. These are really critical partners. So this is what India had to balance. And also I should say that the Middle East on the whole has become a very important strategic space for India. I would argue that outside of its own neighborhood, the Middle East is probably the most strategically significant region for India. If you look at its goals there, not just the partnerships it has and the trade equities and the energy equities it has there, but also its commitment to new transport corridors and connectivity arrangements and commercial groupings like I2U2 and IMEC, things like that. Now, shifting to Pakistan, it's different. Pakistan, it has what I would describe as a very complex relationship with Iran. It's a friendly relationship. It's a workable relationship. There are significant cultural, historical links. As we all know, they share a long border, a 560-mile border. Pakistan also has the largest population of Shia Muslims outside of Iran. But I would argue that there's been several factors that have constrained Pakistan-Iran ties over the years. One of them is the issue of successfully balance its ties between Iran and the Saudis. Pakistan has a deep alliance with Saudi Arabia, and that's really cast a shadow over its outreach toward Iran. I would argue that the rapprochement deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran several years back opened up more diplomatic space for Pakistan to engage with Iran. But still, that Saudi factor looms large. The other constraint in Pakistan's relationship with Iran is cross-border violence, including cross-border militancy. And we all remember that it was just early last year, when Pakistan and Iran had a brief military conflict, right? When Iran launched airstrikes, cross-border strikes in Pakistan, which it said were meant to target anti-Iran militants, which were in Pakistan. I would say this, though, that this conflict, this Iran-Israel conflict, actually brought Pakistan and Iran closer together, because it gave Pakistan an opportunity to throw its full diplomatic, moral, not military or any kinetic support like that, but diplomatic, moral, political support, all types of support to Iran. Pakistan unequivocally backed sorry, I heard a bit of static. Pakistan unequivocally backed Iran. It rejected the Israeli airstrikes, and of course, Pakistan does not have formal relations with Iran. I would also argue that Pakistan potentially had more to lose, potentially in terms of physical security, than any other country in South Asia from an extended war, because of the risks of cross-border spillover. Had there been an extended, deeper conflict, refugee movements would have been an issue. There would have also been the risk of anti-Iran militants, quite frankly, trying to take advantage of Iranian security forces being distracted by Israel and trying to launch new campaigns against the Iranian state, which could have led them to then take retaliations, much like what happened last year. Also, some years ago, Iran has sought to recruit members of its proxy militias from the Shia community in Pakistan. It's also sought to do this from among the Shia community in Afghanistan, but it has sought to do this in Pakistan in the past. And had you had a prolonged war, and had Iran concluded that it needed to generate more recruits for its proxies forces, it could have tried to look to Pakistan again, which is clearly not something that Pakistan would have wanted happening. Just to close here, in terms of other states in South Asia, for the other Muslim majority countries, the approach to the conflict was very simple: to back Iran. Maldives, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, they don't have formal relations with Israel, so it's very, very, very simple. Sri Lanka, very different case, because it's interesting that we know that India has good relations, very good relations with Israel. Sri Lanka actually does too. Going back to to Sri Lanka's civil war years, pretty strong relationship between the Sri Lankan and Israeli militaries. So Sri Lanka took a more nuanced position to the conflict, and its government didn't really have much to say publicly about it at all.
Thank you. And you touched briefly on this is conflict between India and Pakistan, and I'd like to pick up on that. So one analyst in The Diplomat compared the Iran-Israel conflict to the one in May between India and Pakistan, suggesting that Israel and Pakistan benefited from strong ties with particular countries, i.e. the US and China respectively, whereas Iran and India do not enjoy the same sort of all-weather friendships militarily. Do you agree with this analysis, and do you think it might lead India to prioritizing a single relationship over multilateral diplomacy?
Yeah, I mean, I know there've been a number of comparisons drawn between these two conflicts, and I certainly acknowledge that there could be some similarities, but I don't think we should Not sure I agree. It is true, as I noted before, that India only had 3 states support it during its conflict. I mean, it was hoping that the world would view what it was doing as essentially a counterterrorism imperative, responding to what India described as Pakistan-sponsored terrorism in India-administered Kashmir. But of course, as a result, you did not have countries, including close partners of India, whether you're talking about Russia or France or the US or so many others, fully backing India across the board. instead, the call from much of the international community was for de-escalation, not for India to continue to do what it was doing. Um, but this is not because India doesn't have a lot of deep partnerships. It's not because Pakistan was able to count on alliances across the world. India has much more has a much more diversified array of deep partnerships than Pakistan does. Pakistan has a small number of very critical allies, whether you're talking about China or Saudi Arabia, other Gulf states, Turkey, the US to an extent. But I think this goes further than that. The reason why the world responded the way it did to the India-Pakistan conflict was much more focused, in my view, around nuclear escalation risks. That's what the world was worried about. That's why you had so many countries calling for de-escalation. It's very unusual for two neighboring nuclear armed adversaries to be fighting against each other. This thing rarely happens once, but India and Pakistan have done it several times since they both became formal nuclear states in 98. If you start with the Kargil War, and then more recently some brief skirmishes. 2019 comes to mind in particular. And what's particularly, I think, concerning about this for the international community is that we've seen both India and Pakistan willing to less force, conventional force against each other below the nuclear threshold. And so, this most recent conflict, you had the most force used between the two countries against each other since they went nuclear formally. And that is what the international community was responding to. It's not a matter of, India not being able to count on enough close partners. And of course, as you know, India does not do alliances. So it's not like India would have expected other countries to be rallying to its side, providing military support. India was essentially hoping for the moral and diplomatic support that Pakistan and other countries in South Asia provided to Iran during the Iran-Israel conflict. So anyway, that's why I think that this point that you laid out in this Diplomat article, not quite sure I agree with it for those for those reasons.
And moving kind of to the issue of legality, some doubt has been kind of cast over the legality of Israel's initial strikes against Iran, and we're kind of increasingly living in a world where people are doubting the integrity of any so-called rules-based order or of international law. So I wondered what your take would be on this issue in the context of the Iran-Israel conflict.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I'm not sure in this particular case of the Israel-Iran conflict. I associate this rules-based order idea, at least recently, with the Indo-Pacific strategy that the U.S. and many of its allies and partners in Europe and Asia, including and also close partners like India, have subscribed to. I don't necessarily associate Israel and Iran with this particular principle of international order, but absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of double standards here, all around. The U.S., for example, has been criticized many times for backing Israel, and while still pushing for this rules-based order. And Russia has been criticized for calling for principles like respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty while violating these very principles. And the same goes for China. The US, the EU states have been criticized for backing democracy and rights and so on, while pushing for providing more military support to Ukraine in its war in Russia. And I also think there's a sort of a related issue. It gets to a broader point about how when the U.S. decided to get involved in the Israel-Iran conflict, when it bombed those nuclear facilities, it did not seek U.S. congressional authorization for military action. That got a lot of attention here in Washington, but that is a norm that has been honored in the breach for decades here in the U.S. I mean, if you go back to so many examples, right, over the last few decades, the U.S. never seeks congressional authorization, even though that is required by law. I think it's another example. In that case, it refers to domestic politics, but this broader issue of norms and how norms really do not have much of an influence when it comes to decisions about the use of force, particularly when it's used unilaterally. But I'm not an international lawyer, but I do remember from my days in graduate school studying international law in the context of international relations. International law never has it easy, right? It doesn't have the luxury of having at its disposal, enforcement mechanisms, right? I mean, you have these very critical entities like the United Nations and so on that have clout as talk shops, and they set norms through their resolutions and what the UN Security Council does. But it's not binding, or even when it's meant to be binding, it's not really viewed as binding by many other entities because of the lack of for international law when it comes to efforts to constrain warfare and constrain conflict between states.
Thank you. And moving back to South Asia, many analysts have kind of emphasized the vulnerability of South Asian countries regarding gas and oil supply in light of the Iran-Israel conflict. And there was, of course, talk of Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of global shipments of oil and gas are transported. India and Pakistan are, of course, heavily dependent on imports from the Middle East through the Strait, and Nepal and Bhutan in turn dependent upon India. Conflicts such as this obviously have the potential to exacerbate shortages and cause an inflation in prices. So do you think that this conflict might lead to some policy changes in South Asia to avert these vulnerabilities, such as a stronger move towards renewable energy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that just to foot stomp what you said at the beginning of your question about the vulnerabilities of so many South Asian states to volatility in the Middle East as it affects energy security, and not just energy security, but economic security on the whole, right? I mean, if you look at the figures and see that, regionally on the whole in South Asia, there's a significant level of dependence on energy resources, energy imports coming from the Middle East, including those that traverse the Strait of Hormuz. Um, but it also gets to broader considerations about exports as well, right? I mean, if you look at the India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka to an extent as well, they have really important export markets in Europe and the US, mainly for textiles, RMGs in the case of Bangladesh. The EU and the US are two of the biggest export destinations for those goods for all of those countries. They go through the Strait of closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which many experts have indicated was never really that likely to start with because Iran itself could have been impacted economically if it closed it down. But still, looking at that worst case scenario, it's a critical point to acknowledge of just how you're looking at economies in South Asia that, in many cases, even the stronger ones like India's, they are vulnerable, inherently vulnerable to any type of major shock emanating from the Middle East because of the heavy equities and of stakes, economic and energy that they have there. So it's a really important point to consider. So to your question as to whether this recent conflict will lead to policy changes in the region to try to reduce those vulnerabilities. So yeah, I mean, I think there's two possible responses that we could see. One is for countries in the region to look to better diversify their sources of energy so that they're not as reliant on the Middle East. And I should say in fairness that we have already seen this happen to an extent. India has actually made a lot of progress in recent years to expand its energy relationships to the point that it's importing a lot more energy in recent years from Russia. And we all know that that's been a very prominent issue. It's controversial in the West. It's also been scaling up its energy imports from the Americas, including the United States, which is interesting as well. But despite that, India is still very reliant on the Strait of Hormuz. And it's interesting, right after the news broke that Iran's parliament had said that we should close down the Strait of Hormuz, India's petroleum minister, Hardeep Singh Puri, he made a comment in which he basically tried to reassure the Indian public and perhaps Indian markets as well. He said that we've diversified our sources of industry, we've diversified our sources of imports and energy. a lot of our trade volume does not depend on the Strait of Hormuz. It's a very savvy statement to make politically, because that's true for the reasons that I mentioned. It has been able to diversify its sources. And I mean, despite that diversification, based on the estimates that I had seen when I was looking into this some days ago, at the least, a full third of India's oil imports um, come into India via the Strait of Hormuz, and some estimates put the number even higher. So that's a pretty significant reliance there. But yeah, I think that is one step that we will see countries start to take, and I think that's easier said than done in some cases. India, of course, is a country that's it's a rising power. It has significant levels of agency. It already has deep partnerships with countries across the board. It's easier to pursue a broader array of energy relationships compared to some of the other countries in the region. The second response that I think we could see, and again, some countries have already made some progress on this, is indeed what you just suggested, is to focus on renewable energy, indigenous supplies of renewable energy. And much of South Asia is very hardwired for that because of, in the case of solar and wind, hardwired for it because of weather conditions and so on. India for a number of years has been trying to effect an energy transition. Prime Minister Modi has set very ambitious goals that he laid out at the UN climate conferences in recent years. A big push for solar, for wind, more recently for green hydrogen. But I think in India's case, it's not just a matter of looking to focus on renewable energy so that you can draw more indigenous resources from home and not have to depend as much on the Middle East. It's also about indigenous dirty fuels. Coal is something that India has long relied on indigenously. And it's been doing really well. It's been exceeding production targets in recent years. Officials there have been talking about starting to export surpluses. So that's going to continue to be a big part of India's energy picture as well, even as it tries to make this effort. It's much tougher, and it's a work in progress. I mean, in India, but in other countries, one of the big constraints to building out a renewable energy sector is the cost, for sure. Baseline infrastructure. Whether you're talking about not having refueling stations for electric cars or whatever the case may be, storage capacity, battery storage capacity for solar power. This is a major, major constraint. So I think that the first response that I mentioned, trying to expand or diversify energy suppliers so that you don't have to be as reliant on the Middle East, that might make more headway. But as I indicated before, for some of the smaller states of South Asia, that's not as easy to do either. So in the immediate term, bottom line is that the region is going to continue to depend pretty heavily on the Middle East for its energy needs, which indeed means that that those vulnerabilities will continue.
Thank you. And you touched briefly upon other exports not related to gas and oil. And I think, it's important to highlight that these aren't the only issues raised by the conflict. And another good example is how the Middle East, particularly Qatar and Saudi Arabia, serve as flight transfer hubs for South Asian countries. And so as a result of the Iranian strike on an American military base in Qatar, for example, there was significant travel disruption. So I wondered if you wanted to touch on this issue or more broadly about the wider impacts of such conflicts beyond geopolitics in the context of South Asia.
Yeah, I mean, I think here the big point to keep in mind, which I know is well known, is that you have a very large number of expatriates from South Asia living and working in the Middle East, mainly in the Gulf, in the Arab Gulf region. But that does include Iran, and I think I mentioned before there are almost 11,000 Indian nationals in Iran, nationals around the region. Pakistan does as well, not 8 million, but it has several million. Bangladesh also, Nepal. And these folks, some of them are in white collar industries, many of them are migrant laborers, but what really sort of unites them, so to speak, is that many of them send back remittances. They send them back home. And if you look at South Asian economies, some of them are more dependent on remittances than others. I mean, India's economy, for example, is not nearly as reliant on remittances as Nepal's or Bangladesh's are. The smaller economies tend to be more reliant on remittances, but in most of the economies in South Asia, remittances are important. And so, another one of the many reasons why South Asia did not have an interest in a prolonged war between Israel and Iran is that had there been a prolonged war, then there would have been that risk that many of these expatriates would have no longer felt safe. They would have had to evacuate. They would have had to leave the countries they were living in, go back to their home countries, and that could mean interruptions in remittance flows, which could have impacts, for the broader economies. That's one thing. Of course, also there's just the physical safety issue. I mean, as you noted before, as we both noted, briefly this conflict expanded into one in which the U.S. took on a role, and Iran retaliated in Qatar, which raised the risk significantly of a wider regional war. Obviously, the physical security risks for South Asian communities around the region would have been considerable, and that would have, put, significant pressures on their governments back home to ensure that they were provided for, would have had implications for embassies and consulates around the region, and so on. So that's for me what really, I mean, if you step away from the conversations about geopolitical implications and all of that, that's such a large South Asian diaspora in the Middle East. But I mean, to your point about flight diversions, that is a big deal for sure. I mean, the fact that you had people that could not fly into the region, could not fly out to South Asia for a period of time. That definitely had impacts on, in terms of micro impacts in terms of families, communities, and so on. And one could argue that it's something that could have impacted the air industry as well, particularly some of the airliners in South Asia are not in the best economic shape. So if they're in a position where costs go up and there are delays and they can't fly as much, that could have had longer term economic implications. Fortunately, it didn't get to that. But anyway, yeah, I think that on this issue, it's really the fact that you have such a large number. I mean, that the South Asian diaspora in the Middle East is probably one of the largest diaspora communities there, along with those from Southeast Asia, I would assume. But certainly an important factor to keep in mind, especially if this ongoing volatility in the Middle East precipitates a resumption of conflict down the road.
Thank you so much, Michael. And that brings us neatly to the end of our discussion. And we'll now open the floor to questions from the audience. So please either raise your hand to be called upon to ask a question to Michael directly, or alternatively, you can enter a question into the chat box and we can read them out from there. I think, yes, I know Zishan, who's the executive director at PRISA, had a question he wanted to ask you. So Zishan, if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, and thanks, Michael, for providing excellent analysis on the ongoing situation in Iran-Israel conflict and also in the South Asia. My question is more about broader security dynamics in South Asia. Means given that Afghanistan is already facing conflict and there's always a tension between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Recent episode of Pakistan and India conflict and Indian, you can say the military conflict with China as well at the border level sometime. So we see that overall the security situation in South Asia is also not good. You already mentioned, so South Asia is exposed to, like, out of South Asia, any kind of conflict, like the geopolitical situation is changing. But also we feel like South Asia inside is also not, it is also more volatile. And do you think, given this situation, the South Asian countries and the governments there, they are also thinking about solving or reducing this vulnerability by going for the regional cooperation and solving such kind of situation? Or do you think they are still hostile to each other and there would be no cooperation in the future?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very delicate issue for the region because, yes, I think ideally you'd have regional cooperation mechanisms tapped into, but you don't have many of those. As we all know, SARC doesn't really, well, SARC is not a security entity, but SARC, which is the prime regional organization, it doesn't really function very well because of the India-Pakistan problem, and decisions are all made based on unanimity, and India and Pakistan won't agree on much. So instead, I think what we've seen is efforts on bilateral fronts to try to reduce tensions. And I think it is notable, looking at Pakistan specifically, that we have seen, or we did see Pakistan reaching out to Afghanistan, to the Taliban regime there in recent weeks, trying to push for easing tensions. And that happened around the same time that you had that large Pakistani delegation, which included the army chief and the prime minister, going to Iran to meet with leaders. This was not long before the Iran-Israel was everywhere, right? Its border with Afghanistan is hot. Its border with Iran had been hot because of what happened last year, and its border with India is newly hot, so to speak. Well, there's an evergreen hotness there, so to speak. But given the recent conflict, it had been hot. So I think what Pakistan has sought to do is to try to work bilaterally with its neighbors to try to ease tensions to the extent that it can. I think it has succeeded to an extent with Afghanistan for now, with Iran, which is good for Pakistan because the LOC is now extremely hot in ways that it had not been for some years, going back to when the latest LOC truce was concluded in 2021. But beyond that, I don't really see much hope for there to be broader regional efforts to work together to try to reduce these broader disputes, these broader tensions, which in some ways may make sense because a lot of these security tensions play out bilaterally, particularly along borders, right? Whether you're talking about India and China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and going further afield, the increasingly hot Bangladesh, Myanmar border, which is because of the intensifying conflict in Myanmar. These are not issues that would logically be worked out regionally, right? Because they're very different contexts. So in that sense, I think it's helpful when you see these levels of bilateral engagements to the extent that they take place, because that could help lower temperatures a bit. And even going back to India, Pakistan, there's a fragile ceasefire with Israel and Iran. There's a fragile ceasefire with India and Pakistan. There's not much dialogue happening, but the hotline between the Indian and Pakistani militaries, between the GMOs and both sides, it's never closed down. I don't think it's ever closed down in the history of Pakistan and India post 47. So you do have those engagements between the Indian and Pakistani militaries through the hotline. Hopefully that could keep tensions down as well. Again, it's bilateral, and then it's crises and disputes but beyond the bilateral scope. So I think that's a good thing as well.
So there's one question from Mohammed Shafiq in the chat, if you're able to read it, Michael. The first part's not entirely clear, but I think he's getting to the issue of the kind of bipolar world order between the kind of American and Chinese spheres of influence in the context of the Abrahamic Accords and then also this Iran-Israel conflict. So he's asked, is this not the new alignment for liberal global economic exploits?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure if the reference is to the Abraham Accords or not, but I actually think it's useful to make a comment about the Abraham Accords here because it ties into the focus of our discussion. Let me just say this. I think that we could all agree that so much of the region wanted the Iran-Israel conflict to be a brief one, including India. But I think that if you're to have a calming of tensions over an extended period in the Middle East, this I think makes it more likely that the Trump administration would try to revitalize the Abraham Accords. And you all know what the Abraham Accords were. This is something that came about during the first Trump administration, that essentially the Trump administration brokered efforts toward peace between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors, leading to a formal normalization of relations in some cases. But I think that if the conditions allow and the situation becomes less tense in the Middle East, there's going to be another push from this administration for um, uh, more Abraham Accords to take place, so to speak. And Pakistan, I think, could come under the microscope. Um, that would only happen. It would only. I think Pakistan would only if Saudi Arabia signed on to them first. And I'm not an expert on Saudi Arabia. I can't speak definitively if that could happen or not. But if it does, I think then the Saudis would try to prevail on the Pakistanis to sign on to them. I mean, to me, as an analyst of Pakistan, someone that's watched Pakistan and its foreign policy for such a long time, I find it hard to believe that Pakistan would actually be willing to normalize relations with Israel. I mean, its official position is that it will never do that until you have until there's a Palestinian state. Um, uh, I'd also, but there have been indirect links, informal links between Pakistan and Israel over the years. There have been some engagements, including during the Musharraf era. You had a meeting of senior Pakistani and Israeli officials in Turkey. So there've been some sort of experimenting, sort of furtively to engage, but I just can't imagine that happening. But I do think that if conditions permit, and by that I mean there's enough relaxation of tensions that countries in the Middle East once again feel comfortable pushing for the Abraham Accords. The Trump administration will be very much behind that and will try to push for that. And Pakistan could come it could be brought into that. It could be pushed to join. Bangladesh, I think, might be another. Anyway, so that's why I think that we definitely should keep the Abraham Accords in mind here in the broader scope of this resolution of this recent conflict. One other point I'll make here: India really benefited from the Abraham Accords. So India, of course, has had a good relationship with Israel. That's not an issue, but some of these new arrangements and groupings that India has signed on to, I2U2, IMEC, those entities themselves came about only because of the Abraham Accords. The fact that you could have the UAE working with Israel in I2U2, it's because of the Abraham Accords.
Thank you. And then I think there's a question from Uma who has his hand up if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you, Mr. Kugelman. It's been a pleasure listening to you from PRISA platform. You referred to Pakistan reaching out to the Afghan Taliban, and at the same time, there was a delegation which visited Iran. By around the same time, our foreign minister was visiting China. We have seen in recent times very dynamic diplomatic maneuvering from Pakistan's side, which we have not been accustomed to. And ironically, what we expected from a mature democracy like India hurtled into this conflict, which turns out to be an ill thought out aggression by India. And in the wake of the conflict, India was left alone and more isolated internationally than Pakistan. What do you attribute this renewed diplomatic maneuvering from Pakistan to? And secondly, do you think that this can be cited as an example of a hybrid regime triumphing against a populist one?
Yeah, thanks. Interesting question. So I don't think that India is isolated in the world. I don't think India or Pakistan are isolated globally. I mean, as I said before, I think India has a much wider array of partnerships than does Pakistan, particularly on commercial economic levels. I mean, India has close partners pretty much every corner of the world. It's still working on global South partnerships, but it's got some pretty significant capital there. It's trying to compete with China to be the spokesperson of the global South, as it puts it. But you're right that we've seen some interesting turnarounds in recent weeks, and you gave your examples of Pakistan's engagement. So we had this very interesting three-way engagement in China between Pakistani, Chinese, and Bangladeshi officials. So I think that Pakistan has very successfully, I think to the unhappiness of India, very successfully capitalized on some pretty significant geopolitical changes in the region and South Asia. And that includes Sheikh Hasina's departure from power, which opened up possibilities for closer Bangladesh-Pakistan partnership, which really had not had much, there wasn't much there at all, going back several decades, certainly over the 15 years that Hasina was in power. But I think that, India's constraint has really been the way that it wants the world to look at its plight vis-a-vis Pakistan. And I got into this earlier. India's position is that it's taking military action, or took military action against Pakistan, because Pakistan is sponsoring cross-border terrorism in India, and that therefore India has the right, self-defense, counterterrorism imperative to respond, so to speak. The problem, and there's several problems here for India. One is that India has not to this point provided any public evidence linking Pakistan to the horrific Pahalgam terrorist attacks. That's the first issue that India faces, the first challenge. The second one is what I said before. India and Pakistan are both nuclear states. So whenever India uses force against Pakistan, no matter what the circumstances, assuming that it's more than just Indian airstrikes, and that's what we've seen in the last few cases, 2019 and this most recent case, the world is going to focus not on India's counterterrorism imperatives and its right to act in self-defense, and it's going to focus on worrying about the risk of a nuclear war, even if it's very remote. So this is why, initially, after the Pahalgam attack, going back, every country in the world was coming to India's side and expressing its solidarity with India, and this included its rivals like China. Countries across the board were essentially condemning the attack and expressing solidarity with India. And I would think that there likely would have been some of India's friends, including the U.S., that would have quietly, supported India's decision to launch strikes on Pakistan. In that, many countries, many capitals, including the U.S. and others, sympathize with India's position that Pakistan has historically provided support, space, backing for anti-India terrorists. But then once the conflict escalated into something else, when Pakistan responded militarily, which of course was very much expected, and then when you had missiles and drones from both sides going into the other's territory, when you had that's when the international community started to get worried. And that's when India ran into its diplomatic conundrum, so to speak. It could not get around that. And, as you all know, you had 7 different Indian delegations traveling the world, I think 33 different countries, to try to get the world to take its position. The one that I laid out before didn't really work, quite frankly. You can't really disabuse countries of their concerns about their rightful concerns about nuclear escalation risks. I would argue, to be fair, I don't think the Pakistani delegations really changed the views that they were trying to bring about in the places they visited, such as, for example, centering more global attention on Kashmir. I just don't think there's much interest in the international community for that. I really think that, quite frankly, both sets of delegations, the Indian and Pakistani ones, that was really an exercise for a domestic political audience than for interlocutors abroad. Basically, sorry, a long answer to your question. My point is that you have a point, that Pakistan's been able to capitalize on some of these recent, it's just not going to get the world to take its side, given that it has nuclear weapons and Pakistan has nuclear weapons. And when you have them start fighting, the world is going to act a certain way, not the way that India would prefer. But there's really not much that Delhi could do about that. I have one final point on this. At times when the Indian delegation in the U.S., I can't remember if it was when they were in D.C. or New York, they were making the argument that our fight against terror is the world's fight. And I think made a lot of sense, because they were trying to make the point that it's not just India that's been targeted by terrorism, including Pakistan-sponsored terrorism. And if you look at the Mumbai attacks in 2008, which of course killed dozens of Indians, but also other nationalities, including several Americans. So I think that might resonate a bit more. But on the whole, this pitch that India's made, that look, this is terrorism. We need to do what we can to combat it, and we hope you'll support us on it. It's not going to work just because of the nuclear dynamics at play.
Thanks a lot.
So I think I'll try and steer us back to the Iran-Israel conflict. I did have a feeling we might get on to focusing on the Pakistan-India issue, but we'll steer back. So there's been a question from Uma Saeed about whether this conflict will force or encourage Iran to acquire nuclear weapons. And I guess what's relevant to mention is the legal suspension of Iran's cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, and how that's kind of going to reduce oversight over how they develop nuclear energy in the future. So what would your take be on this?
Yeah, and sorry for rambling on about India-Pakistan stuff, but you're right, it's hard to avoid sometimes. Yeah, this is a great question. I'm not an Iran expert, so I can't speak on this definitively. I do think that there's a fairly strong a nuclear bomb would increase based on what happened, but I can't address this definitively just because I'm not an expert on Iran.
No problem. Well, we've got 6 more minutes, so if you want to delve back into the Pakistan-India issue, we can. So there's been a question about how you would analyze the new normal between India and Pakistan in light of the recent conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very unsteady new normal. You know, I've indicated a number of times in recent months that if you look at the history of India-Pakistan relations, after there's a serious crisis, including a war, things will calm down and the two sides will be able to have a bit of a calmer relationship. I don't think that's going to happen this time around, just because the nature of this most recent conflict was so intense. It was the most hostile as we've seen between the two since they went nuclear. That's the first thing. And also, there were so many steps that were taken by both sides, mainly initiated by India, that were punitive in nature but not military. You know, the holding the Indus Waters Treaty in abeyance, shutting down all border trade, including through third countries. Shutting down all trade, including through third countries, closing down the Wagah-Atari border. I think that limits the space for engagement. And you know, some of those steps had not been taken for a long time. The IWT step has never been taken. So I think it's, you know, we're talking about fragile ceasefires in both of these conflicts. You know, I think in the case of India and Pakistan, there's a very good chance that there could be a resumption in conflict down the road. I don't think either country would have an interest in breaking the ceasefire, particularly because each country is looking for international support on a ceasefire, quite frankly. I mean, Israel's a bit of a different case. I mean, we've seen with the Netanyahu government, when it has wartime objectives that it sets out, that it doesn't like them to be interrupted until it feels that it's achieved them. And if Israel is indeed committed to ensuring that Iran never has the capacity to develop a nuclear weapon, then that would suggest that it would have an interest in going back to the fight. So that might be a bit of a difference from the India-Pakistan case. But, you know, we heard the speech that Modi made soon after the ceasefire, in which he basically said that, you know, we're going to war the next time this happens. And he said, when the next time this happens, this means terrorism. And, you know, in the view of the Indian government, any terrorist attack in India would be traced back to Pakistan or to Pakistan-based actors. So, you know, that suggests that, you know, it's not necessarily going to be another conflict immediately, but you know, there likely will be one eventually, and you really have to worry about the intensity of that conflict. And you know, as I said before, we've seen this willingness of both countries to use increasing amount of force below the nuclear threshold, but you know, you keep going up, you keep escalating, you know, you risk, you know, bumping up against that nuclear ceiling, and then what? So that's sort of the nightmare scenario. And again, gets back to what I said before about the international community's big concerns about nuclear escalation risks, which you don't have in really any other case of nuclear armed adversaries.
Thank you, and I'm afraid that's all that we've got time for today. Special thanks from PRISA goes to Michael Kugelman for joining us today, especially ahead of the holiday starting tomorrow, and also to all of our audience members for their participation. And we hope that we might welcome you all back to events hosted by PRISA in the future. Thank you so much, and bye for now.
Thank you very much.